Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum everyone. The most common question and request I get on the Persian Poetics comments is to explain more about a poem, whether it be to transliterate it, to read it aloud, to point out certain details and explain them more, etc. At one point, I tried to do this in the extras chat for the Patreon supporters, but I still feel that there is more that I can explain about poems that I can't really convey in a short voice note or a few sentences about the poem. So I thought I would begin this series where, in this video format, I'll actually read poems and explain in depth and even maybe read the entire poem that a selection of the poem is taken from and post it on the original page as a thank you to the Patreon supporters and inshallah to help them learn more and dig more into this poetry and also maybe to encourage more people to support this page. So inshallah, I'll just begin by going through groups of 9. If you've noticed that the posts kind of they're in tiles now, so every 9 posts has its own design. I figured that for every 9 posts, I would just make one of these videos because one post would be too little to work with. Maybe it would be too short, and more than 9 is probably more than your average attention span. So I figured 9 is a good amount, and every 9 posts, I'll just make a new video. For now, I'm kind of behind because I'm going to start with the posts that have designs, not the really old ones. So inshallah, I'll go at a fast pace and cover what I posted so far. And then once we're caught up, I should say, once we're caught up, I will just make one of these videos every time there's 9 new poems. So here goes without any ado, inshallah, here's the first one. So we can just begin with the first, and I'm just going to pretend that these aren't there, and these also, I have some typos and other things I'd like to correct. So we're just going to pretend that these ones with the nice little birds and flowers are the first set of 9 posts, inshallah. So the first poem says, "The men of God tore the veil of doubt end to end," meaning they found only God as their friend. And in the Persian, "مردان خدا پرده پندار دریدند، یعنی همه جا غیر خدا یار ندیدند." So this is by Foroughi Bastami, who was a 19th century Qajar era poet. So initially this poem can be kind of confusing for people who aren't initiated into Sufi terminology. If you are familiar with the Turkish or Urdu or Arabic poetry tradition, you might know the terms. But basically the few key terms in this poem are men of God, the veil of doubt, and yar, which I've translated as friend in the original, or into the English, I should say. So let's zoom in on the Persian and I'll explain word for word and then also get into the meaning of these terms that are key to Sufi poems. So it says literally the men of God. Here he basically means Sufis, right? Or people who are initiated into the mystical tradition. Parde pindar daridand. They have torn the veil of thought. So parde pindar literally means veil of thought, but here it means a veil that covers, let's say, mystical secrets or truths, divine truths, spiritual truths. So if we think of a veil like a face veil or a hijab or a curtain or something like that, this is kind of a metaphor, not a real veil, but essentially saying something that's like a veil or covering you or between you and the truth, let's say, and it's covering the truth from you. So he's saying men of God, people of true spirituality, they've torn this veil that comes in between the spiritual, let's say, traveler or the mystic and the truth. And in the second bait he says, or in the second misra I should say, Yani hame jan ghayr khuda yar nadidan, meaning in every place other than God they didn't find a yar, which here, for the sake of the rhyme, I translated as friend because it rhymes with end. However, yar can be translated as beloved, lover, friend, God. It's kind of open for interpretation. Now, I really like this poem, so I thought that would actually get into the entire poem. Not the whole thing, but selections of it that I think are really nice and worth looking at right now. The whole poem would take quite a long time to read the whole thing, but inshallah, I'll look at a few baits. But I think it's also important to mention who the poet is, because he's not really a well-known poet. So Foroughi Bastami comes in the 19th century. This is Qajar era Iran. And he comes in a period called Bazgasht Adabi, which literally means literary return. At this point, the poets of Iran had felt that the poetic tradition had declined quite a bit since the Middle Ages. So in Iran, I don't know when this thought started, maybe it started then, there's a sense that the peak of Persian poetry is the 12th to 15th centuries. So basically beginning with Sadi and ending with Jami in those areas. Jami, my apologies. So it's this about 3 or 4 century period where Persian poetry was at its peak, and then, since then, it kind of just declined up until the 19th century. And at that point, the people thought, look, the key to fixing Persian poetry or getting it back is for us to do a bazgash, to return to that peak era. And basically, they did that by, I don't want to say copying, but you could basically call it copying that tradition. So they used images, themes, concepts, you name it, from that era. Now, of course, this didn't last, and now we're in the era of modernist poetry without, rhyme or meter as we traditionally understood it. Of course, there's still classical poems being written, but it tends to be in the minority, I think, as far as I know, and especially the world over. We're in the modern era with, Njamin and all this stuff. So it wasn't successful. Why wasn't it successful? Well, one of the thoughts I have is, well, things that aren't original tend to not do well, and things that are out of place, whether time, space, culture reasons, also tend not to do well. And another reason is, even if you are inclined to classical poetry, the classical era, 4 centuries of Persian poetry, it's so vast that there's so many poems you could really go your whole life reading a new one every day and never run out. So there really is no need for this new layer of attempt classical poetry. And again, I say attempt. It's not even really as good as the original. If you look into it, again, there's a reason that Foroughi Bastami has a big divan, but only 1 or 2 ghazals, such as this one, are well known. This one is particularly good, just by exception. Not to diminish their efforts, of course. I, as a neo-traditionalist, you could say in poetry, I admire their efforts, but just got to be realistic with our analysis and say that yes, this movement wasn't really that successful. The classical era was never revived, and that's of course comes with its own reasons. It's impossible to go back in history and import the past into the present. So anyway, without further ado, I hope that wasn't boring, but it's kind of a necessary explanation for the context of this ghazal. Hopefully, we'll get into this ghazal now, inshallah. So we read the first bait, and then the second bait he says, "Har das ke dadand, az on das gereftand. Har nukte ke guftand, hamon nukte shenidand." So he says, any hand they gave, they got from that hand. So he's saying any good they did, they saw good back. Har nukte ke guftand, anything that they said. Nukte in Arabic means a joke, if you're a speaker of a modern Arabic dialect. But in this case, in Persian, in classical Persian, which this poem is written in, it means like a subtlety or point, or like a small nugget of truth, let's say. So any point that they said, they heard it back. So he's saying any wisdom they imparted, they also heard wisdom. Let me see. I'll pick some of the baits that I think are especially meaningful. This from here on is very good. جمعی به در پیر خرابات خرابند قومی به بر شیخ مناجات مریدند. So you're saying jam'i, and pay attention, he's contrasting this with qawmi. This is an internal scheme to it. So jam'i is contrasted with qawmi, and kharabat is contrasted with munajat, and kharaband is contrasted with muridand. And also pir is also contrasted with sheikh. So you see in this bait, it's almost the same. Jam'i qawmi be bardar sheikh pir munajat kharabat kharaban muridan. Sadi Shirazi, who is actually from the era that these poets are trying to replicate, is a master at this. So inshallah we'll see more by Sadi in the future. But this bait, I just want you to pay attention to these subtleties that might not initially be obvious. And when you actually sing it out, it becomes very clear. جمعی به در پیر خرابات خرابند قومی به بر شیخ مناجات مریدند. So you can almost see not only spontaneous their rhyme and meter, but it has an internal rhyme as well. So you're saying jam'i, and the ye here attached to jam, which means group, means just one. So one group are at the door of the pir, which means a sage or mystic or sheikh, of the kharabat, and they're kharaband, which means kharab hastand. So where is the kharabat? In a medieval city, you can imagine, which again kind of goes to why these poems are out of place, because they're far past the medieval era and into modern city planning. But in the medieval era, a city had the city walls, right? So you had the internal, the center with the bazaar and the grand mosque and maybe a palace and then or castle, and then around you had these embattlements and a wall, and that kind of kept the outsiders out. So the kharabat was literally, it's a plural of kharabe, which means broken place. So kharabat, the broken places, were on the exteriors of these cities, right outside or at the edges near the city wall. And that's where, let's say, disliked characters were. So, Sufis with tattered clothes and drunk people and sex workers and things like that. Basically, the discarded or disliked people of societies, maybe discarded is a harsh word to use. So kharabat kind of became synonymous with wine house in Sufi poetry, basically, like where the Sufis who aren't quite in the mainstream of society hang out. To be kharab, or broken, meant drunk, basically. So like drunk with mystical knowledge and the love of God. So he's saying, Jam'i bedar pir kharabat kharaban, a group or at the door of the sage of the kharabat, the broken down place, kharab, drunk. Qawmi, so here is contrasting jam with qawm. Jam is a group, qawm is a clan, so a bigger group. So in the first line, he's referring to Sufis, who are the khas or the khabbas or plural. The khas means the, let's say, specific, or it's a very like elitist almost way, ironically, because Sufism is supposed to be against elitism, but it's kind of an ironically elitist way of describing yourselves. A small group who understand tasawwuf, and then qawm are a clan, a large group of people, the am or awam, the masses, the laity, the people who are not initiated into tasawwuf. بدر پیر به بر شیخ مناجات مریدن. Excuse me for the reading errors, it's quite late. They're at the side of the sheikh of munajat, which means prayers. It literally means like whispered prayers and the original meaning of Arabic, but here he means prayers, but he's picked the word munajat instead of the normal word for prayers because it has an internal rhyme with kharabat. So he's saying they're at the side of the sheikh, or they're with the sheikh who prays, and they're his murids, they're his followers. So basically he's saying a group of people are in the wine house and with the Sufis, and we'll see this continued later in the poem, they're with the khas, and then we have another group of the average people. And then again in this, you see again not only the internal rhyme again, but he's also keeping the same contrast with one masra with the other. Yik jam nakushide residan be maqsad. So this yik jam is this right here, the same group of people he's talking about. So one group without kushesh, without attempt. So one group have, without even trying, have reached the destination. In another clan, or one clan, again the awam, the laity who aren't involved in tasawwuf or are initiated, they ran doidan wa be maqsad naresidan, and they didn't get to the goal or the destination. فریاد که در رهگذر آدم خاکی بس دانه فشاندند و بسی دام تنیدند. So he's saying, I cry out, or whoa, oh my God, in the rahguzar, in the pathway of the man of dirt. Literally Adam, like Hazrat Adam alayhi salam, like the prophet, of the man made of dirt. And this, of course, in Persian, Arabic, Urdu, just means a person. They have thrown many seeds, and they have also laid many traps. So a seed is a symbol of growth, positive, and a trap, of course, it's a negative sign. And then he says, همت طلب از باطن پیران سحر خیز زیرا که یکی را ز دو عالم طلبیدن. He says, seek, spiritual help, guidance, things like that, from the batin, the inside of the peers, the sages who wake in the morning. Sahar means morning, khiz means to rise. So seek guidance, help, etc. from the inside of the peers who wake in the morning. زیرا که یکی را ز دو عالم طلبیدن, because they've sought one, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the two worlds, this world and the afterlife. So this is a command in this verse, and then the next one he's about to do the opposite, a nahi. زنهار مزن دست به دامان گروهی که از حق ببریدن و به باطل گرویدن. So he says, never attach your hand or grasp literally the dress hems of a group. So this is a symbolism in Persian poetry. You can imagine like a traditional Persian garb such as the one I'm wearing that has a hem, right, like this. And this is a symbol of being a follower, is to grab onto the hems of it. Don't grab onto the hems of a group that have cut themselves off from the haqq, the truth, the divine truth, and have attached themselves to the batil, which means falsehood. He says, چون خلق درآیند به بازار حقیقت ترسم نفروشن متاعی که خریدند. He's saying, so when the creation come out into the bazaar of haqiqah, which is, this is such a beautiful line. He says, when the creation, us, the khalq, come out into the bazaar of haqiqah. Haqiqah is the world we're living in, and he's calling it a bazaar. Now think about a bazaar. What is it like? It's loud, it's transient, there's a lot of chaos. It's a beautiful metaphor for the dunya. I very rarely see it, if ever. Maybe this is the first time I've seen it. And you think about a bazaar, it's a perfect example of the dunya. It's a short place that passes quickly. You pass through it. It's loud. It's full of ruckus. It's easy to get distracted and lost. ترسم نفروشن متاعی که خریدن. I fear they won't sell, or in this case it means pass on, the goods that they purchased. So he's talking about the people who are coming from, let's say, the other world into our world, the world that we inhabit. I worry that they won't pass on the divine secret that they exchanged for before they came here in the world before this one. And this is a concept that I will inshallah discuss in a class later. This is kind of too big for this already kind of lengthy commentary. He says کوتاه نظر غافل از آن سرو بلند است که این جامه به اندازه هر کس نبریدند. کوتاه نظر literally means short-sighted. The short-sighted is heedless of that tall cypress tree because this cloth or this jama, literally this clothes, has not been cut to everyone's size. So kutah nazar is a person who doesn't understand the realities of tasawwuf. And he is heedless of that tall cypress, which is a symbolism for the beloved and beauty, perhaps God, perhaps divine truth here. It's up to your interpretation. For this cloak, he means a Sufi garb, has not been cut to everyone's size. I remember one time, subhanAllah, I was asking one of my teachers here in Iran, what do you do with someone who keeps arguing and fighting with religion and you want to get them onto a religious path and they won't listen or they keep arguing with you or bothering you? My Ustad very bluntly said, "Kain jame be andaze har kes naburidan." Not everyone is going to fall into the same line. Some people are going to go astray, some people are going to go on the right path, and subhanAllah, you can just pray for their guidance is all we can do with some people. So this line is essentially saying that this clothes were not cut to everyone's size. So this ghazal, I didn't even go through, I think I went through half of it only. It's just so packed with meaning. We're going to have to leave it. Maybe a different day there can be a class where this whole ghazal is explained. But subhanAllah, it's just such a beautiful poem. So now we'll go back to the posts. And let's go to the second one. So this one's a bit more simple than that one. It doesn't really require much explanation. It's by Baba Tahir. I'm a candle whose tears burn away. Anyone with a burned heart feels this way. I wail all day and cry all night. Without you, this is my night and day. Now we'll read the Persian. من آن شمعم که اشکم آتشین بی که هر سوت دلی حالش همین بی همه شب گریم و نالم همه روز بی ته شامم چنان روزم چنین بی. So for those of you who have studied Persian, you'll immediately notice that this is not written in classical Persian. So I'll point out some differences. So the first line, it's actually very similar, except B, which is repeated in the rhyme. B is bashad or bovad, it means is. B in normal Persian means without. And he also uses it to mean that as well here, but I'll get to that later. But in this case, it means is. In the second line, the word sukhte is written as sute. You can probably pretty much recognize that if you know Persian. It's a common contraction in language. And then in the last line, you see bi te. This is to, but to becomes te in his dialect. And sham just means night here, but it's not common in Persian, but it exists in some dialects in classical Persian as well. So Baba Tahir was a poet who was very clouded in mystery. We're actually not sure what century he's even from. Some say 10th, some say up to 13th. We don't know anything about him really other than he was a Sufi from Hamadan, a wandering Sufi. The reason we know he's a wandering Sufi is because he has Oryan in his name, which means naked, but this means naked of possessions or good clothing, not literally naked, of course, or I hope not. Hamadani just means he's from the city of Hamadan. Other than that, not much is known about him. His poems are in a folk register as opposed to classical Persian, which gives the impression that he wasn't very well educated. He wasn't, an alim, a learned person like Maulana Rumi or Saadi or something like this. His divan suffers from an authenticity problem, kind of like Khayyam, akin to that divan as well. You see it growing over the years. So basically what this means is it appears and then over the years people add their own poems to it and the poems that people have written get mixed up with the originals and then it just keeps increasing in size. That's one theory that's kind of more conservative. A different theory is that he didn't actually exist at all. He's a composite character or a frame author is the more correct term, kind of like Shahrazad from 1001 Nights, meaning that a bunch of stories that kind of existed and folk traditions were added in 1001 Nights and Shahrazad was made the author. The same theory would go that Baba Tahir, these are just folk poems that were compiled together and given the authorship of one person, let's say. It's also rumored that Khayyam was like that, although I'll get more into that in the future, inshallah. So on to the next poem. Excuse me, the internet is a bit slow. Beggars wish their children blind for the daily bread. To earn, doctors wish to see, all in pain and dread. The embalmers are happy to see people dead. I love entertainers who wish to see us happy instead. So now I'll read the Persian. گدایان بهر روزی طفل خود را کور می‌خواهند. طبیبان بهر روزی مردمان رنجور می‌خواهند. همیشه مرده شوران راضی‌اند از مردن مردم. بنازم مطربان مخلوق را مسرور می‌خواهند. So it's fairly straightforward. This poem is without authorship. It's not attributed to anyone. This is kind of common for kind of folky rubais or quatrains. It kind of just pass around from mouth to mouth, written down, sent here and there. It's not quite clear who wrote it. But this is pretty complicated to explain to someone who's from the modern world and is not kind of initiated with how the pre-modern world worked. So literally every single line requires an explanation. And for those of you who've been following for since this poem was posted, there was actually a series of stories explaining it, but khair, I'll also explain it here as well, so you don't have to go all the way back and find that in the highlights. So it should be explained first of all, especially for those of you living in first world countries and who haven't visited the Middle East, Muslim world, India, Pakistan, etc. In the modern Western world, capitalist countries, begging is kind of an individual affair. A person loses their job, has mental health issues they're struggling with addiction, and they end up, unfortunately, may God help them all, may God help everyone struggling with poverty, inshallah, ya Rab, they end up on the street and they have to beg. Now, this rarely becomes a generational thing. You rarely see a parent and a child that's homeless, right? So in a Western country, certain institutions would kick in and would, for better or for worse, take the children away, etc. But in Muslim countries, not so much in Iran anymore, this is changing as the economy gets better and the country is more developed, but in other places, unfortunately, you do see this, where there are generational beggars, or there's generational poverty. So someone is a beggar, unfortunately, and I don't mean to cast judgment in any way, it's an unfortunate circumstance, and their kids are raised as well by them in the streets, and their kids are beggars. And sometimes you do see this still commonly in Iran, unfortunately, although it's getting less common, as I said, children beggars. And this part specifically that this refers to is very uncommon now, but this is still practiced, unfortunately, in some countries where the beggars say, well, if I disfigure my child, they'll attract more sympathy and they'll get more money. So sometimes it's mild, like a scar. Other times, it's blinding or removing of finger digits or limbs or legs. It's very unfortunate, but it is a practice that exists. Now, as these practices become less common, these poems become less resonant. Alhamdulillah, they become less resonant. I hope this never happens. But it's important to understand this context to get it, or get this line. And in the second line, it's less difficult to understand in the modern context. The only difference is that a lot of times now doctors live in regulated systems where their salary doesn't really go up and down depending on how many patients they have. And countries with socialized healthcare, this tends to be the case. Although America with privatized healthcare, it is not the case. Same thing with Iran and many Muslim countries. The more patients a doctor sees, the richer they get. So this kind of applies to this day, just like the first line, unfortunately. The second line doesn't require, subhanAllah, this third one requires less than the second and the first as well. So basically an embalmer, mord shur in Persian, qassal in Arabic, is just someone who cleans the dead. I'm not sure how that works in the Western tradition. I think they remove organs maybe, but in the Middle East, we don't do that usually. We just, and the Muslims, of course, they just wash the body, bury the body, etc. So this goes without saying, the person who deals with the dead is funeral home director, whatever context you want to apply to. They're happy to see people dead. And the last one, this is probably the most distant from our modern context. Basically, in traditional, I don't want to say all Muslim societies, but in Iran, I know that in other countries it's like this. Being an entertainer or musician was seen as a bad thing for a few reasons. One, a lot of Muslims at the time, I think still to this day, consider music haram, so it's a haram profession, like selling alcohol or gambling. And second of all, it's considered generally a profession without sharaf, without honor. It's considered not like being a doctor or a lawyer, it's kind of a lowly thing. And I mean, subhanAllah, I have a cousin, won't say on which side, he's actually a very good professional Persian musician. He's reaching the level of an expert, really, subhanAllah, mashallah. But till this day, his family considers it shameful that he abandoned, becoming a PhD and decided to become a musician. Even though he's a great musician, if anyone should be in music, it should be him. But it's still, to this day, it's not really considered a good profession. So this poem is basically saying these people that you view positively, more people who have normal jobs, excluding the beggars, but the doctor and the embalmer, they're not as good as you say. But hey, the entertainers, they just want to see us happy. So, for better or for worse, this poem still does resonate in modern Iran. And I actually heard it in a cafe and I wrote it down. That's how it ended up on this page. So the next one. This one actually requires the least explanation. It's totally universal, subhanAllah. Um, to mend a heart that's in pain isn't easy. Putting together a broken glass again isn't easy. You can conquer a mountain despite its size, but to conquer words said with disdain isn't easy. دل که رنجید از کسی خرسند کردن مشکل است. شیشه بشکسته را پیوند کردن مشکل است. کوه را با آن بزرگی میتوان هموار کرد. حرف ناهموار را هموار کردن مشکل است. So there don't seem to be any ambiguities in the grammar, and the meaning is pretty straightforward, so I think we can leave it at that. This one as well is pretty straightforward. So it says, don't be hurt if you receive no note. My tears wiped away whatever I wrote. نامه از من اگر سویت نمی آید نرنج. هر چه را من می نویسم اشک پاکش می کند. So again, very straightforward. All right. Now this one is a bit interesting. There's some story behind this one. My saddened heart was bit by the snake of allure. There's no cure my clever healer can procure. The one whose beauty I've fallen in love with, he's the one who has my medicine and cure. زد مار هوا بر جگر غمناکم سودی نکند فسونگر چالاکم آن یار که عاشق جمالش شدم هم نزد وی اسراقی و تریاکم. So if you're Iranian or familiar with the Iranian show and movies, you might know that this is actually the song, the poem, and the music for the Imam Ali alayhi salam TV show that aired. I don't know if it's the 90s or early 2000s. It's pretty old. I remember hearing this when I was growing up, so maybe it's early 2000s. Sounds more accurate. Basically, this was part of the intro. It's this quatrain. Now, what's interesting about this, and it's very rare, I can't think of anything like this that comes off the top of my head, it's actually a Persian translation of an Arabic poem. This is very interesting. I very rarely see this. I sometimes see Persian explanations of Arabic poetry. I have some books back there that are like that. But I very rarely see an Arabic poem translated into Persian poetry, specifically that. Now, I'm going to actually read for you guys as well the the Arabic equivalent, that was translated from. Here you can see the picture. I think this is Malik Ashtar radiallahu anhu, and I'm not sure who this Sahabi is. But this is the original Arabic poem. كل صبحي وكل إشراق أيا تبكي عيني بدمع مشتاق أيا قد لسعت حية الهوى كبدي فلا طبيب لها ولا راقي إن الحبيب الذي شفقت به. I think this should be huwa, or maybe not wow at all. I think this is a mistake. عنده رقيتي وترياقي. So let's get into this. Every morning and every ishraq sunset, and this is an evocative, like, oh, cries my eye with the tears of yearning. So if you know Persian or Urdu, a lot of these words are loaned into the language. So almost you can almost make it out even if you didn't know Arabic. قد لسعت حية الهوى كبدي. It's bit my what is it in English? Liver? Yeah, liver. The snake of hawa, infatuation. So this is pretty complicated for someone who's not initiated. Basically, in Persian, Turkish, Urdu, Arabic poetry, we have the idea of the liver being similar to the heart. Basically, it's thought of an organ of love. I'm not sure where that came from or why. It's kabad in Arabic, and in Persian, it is jigar. In Persian, interestingly, and Arabic, jigar is used as a term of endearment, but in Persian, it can have just be careful, just as a warning, it can have a sexual connotation, so just be careful with that. So someone might say jigaram, but it's kind of, again, don't just use it casually. And the Arabs as well can say bad chabdi. For example, I know Iraqis say that bad, like right next to, you're next to my liver is where you are in my heart, basically. So he's saying the snake of infatuation bit my liver. فَلَا طَبِيبَ لَهَا وَلَا رَقِي. So there is no doctor or cure to it. إِنَّ الْحَبِيبَ الَّذِي شَفَقْتُ بِهِ. Verily the beloved that I have fallen in love with or loved or befriended, عَنْدُهُ رُقْيَةِ وَتَرْيَاقِ. He is my cure and my poison. So the lover has my poison. He's bit me, but he is also my cure, and the cure is himself. So subhanAllah, this is very beautiful. But I will say that the quatrain is This is the quatrain that's translated into Persian that you can see right here. These two original at the top, these two right here, I don't know why they weren't translated, but yeah, so this is just to keep in mind. This corresponds with the Persian, right? So that is that, and on to the next poem. All right. Again, I apologize for the slow internet. I won't medicate for one made ill by a lover. No medicine can make his heart recover. داروی دل نمی کنم که آن که مریض عشق شد هیچ دوایی نیاورد باز به استقامتش. So this is from Sa'di. Literally says, I won't medicate my heart for the person who is sickened by love. No cure, or no medicine, I should say. No medicine will make him literally rise again. But I've interpreted this, in the translation as cure him, basically. So I thought that I would look at this ghazal, the original, because it's just so beautiful. So he says, آن که هلاک من همی خواهد و من سلامتش هر چه کند ز شاهدی کس نکند ملامتش. He says, the one who wants my destruction and I want his good health, whatever he does from shahidi, which means, shahid means beloved basically, but shahidi means to be kind of a bad beloved, let's say. کس نکند ملامتش, no one will blame him. میوه نمیدهد به کس, باغ تفرج است و بس, جز به نظر نمیرسد سیب درخت قامتش. So he's saying he won't give a fruit to anyone. He's a garden of walking and that's it. Other than to the sight, you won't get the chin, or the apple I should say, of the tree of his height. The apple is here, right here. So imagine if I didn't have a beard, some people have like a cleft, or you could say butt chin, and that kind of looks like an apple. So it's like a metaphor for the lips and the chin of the beloved. So he's saying he won't give any fruit, meaning this, he won't kiss anyone. He's a garden that you can just walk through. Other than to the eyes, you won't actually reach the apple of the tree of his height. So he's saying he's a beloved that no one can actually reach. And this is the line that I translated. And I think I'll translate just a couple more. I don't want this to be very long. I wanted these to be short, inshallah, but as you can see, we're going very long. So I'll read the last two. کاش که در قیامتش بار دیگر بدیدمی که آنچه گناه او بود من بکشم غرامتش. He says, if only in the day of judgment, قیامت, I would see him one more time. For what his sins were, or what he did as a sin, I would take the punishment for that sin. هر که هوا گرفت و رفت از پی آرزوی دل گوش مدار سعدیا بر خبر سلامتش. He says, whoever had hawa, or got infatuated, and went to seek his heart's desire, don't have an ear, or don't be listening for, O Sadi, don't be listening for news of his good health. So a few notes on grammar. This alif is short for ya. So this just means ya Sadi, Sadia, Hafiza. Just think of it as ya, or like in Arabic a. It's just calling out. This ye here comes from hami. So you can pretend this be is in here and just say didam, as I could say didam. Didami is I see at this moment. Hami didam. And be, when you put it before a verb, it indicates the directness, like right now. Bigireft, he took at that moment, like it gives a sense of suddenness. Like I would suddenly see him, basically, is what he's saying. So didam is the base, and you add a be and a ye, and it's like I would suddenly see then, is what it basically means. So subhanAllah, just by adding 2 letters to this 4-letter word, you make so much more meaning. This is a small subtlety. So, and that's a ghazal, and one day, inshallah, maybe in a class, I can go through this whole ghazal. So this is a quatrain of unknown authorship from an 18th, I can't remember, or 17th century text about madrasa education in Iran. So one thing to consider is that this is the cusp of modernity entering in modern sciences, modern education, etc. Back then, there was just madrasa-style education, and of course, madrasas still exist, but they've kind of been relegated to a certain segment of society, and secular sciences and learning have been privileged. But in any event, it's just important to understand what context this is coming from. He says, in school we spoke and heard what they said, but we never revealed a hair of the world's head. Though we solved multitudes of problems, the answers led only to more myths instead. So he says, در مدرسه کردیم بسی گفت و شنود و سر جهان یک سر مو رخ ننمود هرچند گشودیم بسی مشکلها ز اینها به جز افسانه کاری نگشود. So I'm trying to think if there's anything worthy of explaining that could be confusing in the Persian. It seems pretty straightforward. One thing that I will explain though is that سر مخ ننمود. سر مو رخ ننمود. So he's saying, he's comparing basically the head of a human to the world, wherein they're both round. And to discover something is to show the tip of a hair, literally is what he's saying. Yek sara mu roch nanamut. So like the tip of a hair didn't show its face. So to discover something is to show the hairs of it. And you can also say, if you want to say like splitting hairs, literally we have the same idea in Persian. We say mui shikaftan, to split a hair. So this is like a kind of a metaphor for understanding things. And if you think in that society where women and men like me, you could see had turbans as well, men, everyone's hair is covered, you can see kind of the, let's say, the resonance of analogies about hairs and revealing them to learn things. It's very basic, kind of saying that I went to school and I went back and forth and I didn't really actually learn anything. And I feel that, unfortunately, I can resonate with this as well. So this last poem is interesting. It's actually in Arabic, it's not in Persian. So if you notice, sometimes I break the rules in Persian Poetics and I translate an Arabic poem because I happen to like it very much. In life, be a passenger on your way, and leave beautiful traces of your stay. For we are but guests in this world, and a guest must be on their way. كن في الحياة كعابر سبيل وأترك وراءك كل أثر جميل فما نحن في الدنيا إلا الضيوف وما على الضيوف إلا الرحيل. So subhanAllah, this is beautiful. It reminds you of Persian the way it's written in a quatrain. This poem, interestingly, is actually directly inspired from a hadith. And the hadith is found in Bukhari and the Arba'in of Imam Nanawi rahimahullah. I'm just going to read from the Bukhari. So it says, Abdullah ibn Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, said, Allah's Messenger alayhi salatu wassalam, took hold of my shoulder and said, be in this world as if you were a stranger or traveler. The sub-narrator added, Ibn Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, used to say, if you survive till the evening, do not expect to be alive in the morning. And if you survive till the morning, do not expect to be alive in the evening. And take from your health for your sickness, and take from your life for your death. So in the Arabic, I'll just highlight what you can say, or what you can see in the poem, I should say. Kun fi dunya ka annak qarib u abir sabil. So he took this, kun fi dunya ka, and you could say kun fi dunya ka, but then he shortened it so that it would fit. And then he took Abir Sabil and fit it in here for the meter and the rhyme. This is a normal practice, of course, in the Masnavi. Rumi does this with Hadith and Quran as well, just kind of moving some letters around so that you can reference the original text, but also make it conform with the rhyme and meter so that it's correct in terms of poetic rules. So subhanAllah, this is a really beautiful poem, and that's why I posted it even though it's not in Persian. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is that although the Quran and Hadith references might not be as explicit as this one, so in this poem it's very obvious it's from the Hadith because it's in Arabic and it's literally a direct quote. But a lot of times in Persian poetry, there are references to Quran and Hadith, direct and indirect, paraphrase and direct quote, and it's not so obvious. And even sometimes there's layers of references, for example in Hafiz, etc., and in some of the commentaries of these poetry collections, the commentators actually, subhanAllah, went and combed through the Hadith and Quran and kind of said, hey, this is a reference to this is a reference to this, sometimes when it's not very obvious. So it kind of just shows, again, we're trying to re-emphasize that, hey, these poems are from the Islamic, let's say, Islamic tradition, and it kind of just shows how beautiful that is because these poems are literally directly inspired from the Quran and Hadith. And again, this is very obvious, direct quote. And Rumi's Masnavi, there's tons of direct Quran and Hadith quotes, but sometimes not so obvious. If it's in Persian, so it's a translation of the thought. In Sadi's Golistan, he quotes Quran and Hadith all the time. But just generally, it's important to understand, even when it's not directly apparent, we're kind of in the Quran and Sunnah atmosphere when we're engaging in this poetry, subhanAllah. So that was it. That was the first 9 of this series. Inshallah, I'll just continue. As you can see, there's a lot to get through before we actually even catch up to where we are. So until I catch up, I will continue to work at kind of a faster pace. And then once I'm caught up, inshallah, I'll just release a new video as they're needed. This was the first one. Of course, in the future, this could be slightly different, the format, the way I go. So if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, etc., you can just leave them in the comments here, Patreon message, WhatsApp chat, in the Patreon members chat. basically, any way you can get to me, you can just let me know if you'd want to see something different or a tweak or another question. I'd love to address it. If you know anyone that is interested in this type of video and would like to support this project on Patreon, you could suggest that they join Patreon and get access to these. I'd also like to just generally thank you all for being Patreon supporters. Again, this is no exaggeration. I owe this project to you all, because if it wasn't for you, I couldn't afford to take time, out of where I would have to work otherwise, more than I already do, to basically work on this project. So it is really only with your Patreon help that I'm able to get the sources like the books you see, and also take time out of my life, which is already, I don't want to say, be exaggerating, which is already quite busy, and spend time on this page. So again, thank you so much. Thank you times 1,000 for helping make this page a reality. So that's it for the first video. Inshallah, I hope to see you in more. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and have a nice day.